The first thing people usually assume about those who enjoy being alone is that they are introverted, shy, independent, self-sufficient, that they don't need much connection with family or friends to feel complete, that they choose solitude because it offers freedom, clarity, and peace. And sometimes that is true. But have you ever considered that this explanation might be too superficial? What if this comfort in being alone is less about preference and more about protection? What if solitude has nothing to do with not liking people? What if your internal system learned, at some point, to experience closeness as a risk? These questions are rarely asked, and that may be exactly why so many people confuse emotional distance with strength and self-confidence. In this video, we explore what may truly be behind your desire to be alone, and why society may be rewarding a way of protecting yourself that over time came to look like identity. If you observe your own behavior closely, you might begin to notice certain patterns. You feel calmer when no one expects anything from you, lighter when you don't have to explain yourself. You may even feel a quiet comfort when social plans are cancelled. You enjoy long periods without contact. And when relationships begin to require more presence, more emotional availability, more vulnerability, something inside you closes. Not because you don't care about people, but because when you weigh the pros and cons, an unspoken conclusion emerges. All this closeness feels too exhausting to be worth the cost. At first glance, this looks like independence. It looks like emotional maturity, like someone who knows how to be alone without suffering. But there is an important distinction that is rarely noticed. True independence feels spacious. It doesn't require constant effort. It isn't accompanied by bodily tension or the sense of always needing to stay guarded. What many people are actually experiencing is not independence, but relief. Relief from not having to adapt, from not having to measure words, emotions, or reactions. As if, when alone, something finally lowers its defenses. As if for the first time that day the body understands that it doesn't need to stay on alert. This shows up in small details, in the way your body relaxes when the door closes, in the indescribable relief of leaving your phone turned off, and even better without having to explain yourself to anyone. In the feeling of being more yourself when no one is watching. These are not signs of coldness. They are signs that, at some point in your history, connection began to require vigilance, adjustment, or self-control. This internal state is so common that British psychoanalyst and pediatrician Donald Winnicott dedicated much of his work to understanding it. He was deeply interested in early emotional development, especially in what happens when a child grows up in an environment that does not respond consistently to their needs, not necessarily abusive, just emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, or overwhelmed. In such environments, the child learns something essential very early on. Certain parts of the self are not welcome. Certain emotions are too much for others to handle. Certain needs find no response, and because a child cannot survive without some form of connection, they adapt. They begin shaping who they are according to what the environment can tolerate. Winnicott gave this adaptation a name: the false self. The false self is not false in the everyday sense of the word. It is not manipulation. It is not dishonesty. It is a survival structure, a way of maintaining connection by reducing one's needs, by becoming easy, by becoming self-sufficient too early. When there is no one to rely on, the child learns to rely on themselves, not by choice, but by necessity. Over time, this adaptation becomes invisible even to the person themselves. It starts to feel like personality, independence, strength. But beneath it lies a quiet story, the experience of having to carry alone what should have been shared. Emotional self-sufficiency becomes a shield, not because closeness is undesired, but because closeness once brought frustration, intrusion, or emotional risk. This is why, according to Winnicott, many adults who appear extremely independent are not that way because they feel safe. They are that way because depending on others was never safe. The false self learns how to function in the world. It adapts, it performs, it doesn't ask for much. And in doing so, it protects the most vulnerable core, the true self, by keeping it hidden. Being alone in this context feels safe because it requires no performance, no monitoring, no adjustment. When you are alone, the false self can rest. There is no need to manage a version of yourself created to please others, no risk of being misunderstood or emotionally abandoned. Solitude becomes a space where nothing is demanded, and therefore nothing can be lost. But this story does not exist in isolation. It is not confined to childhood, nor does it end with early relationships. This way of learning how to exist, contained, self-sufficient, emotionally discreet, continues to develop throughout life. And as the individual grows, it encounters a world that not only accepts this mode of functioning, but often rewards it. The adult who learned early not to need, not to burden, not to depend, enters a society that calls this strength. A world that admires those who endure alone, that praises those who don't ask for help, that confuses maturity with constant self-sufficiency. What began as emotional adaptation stops being seen as defense and starts being framed as virtue. This is where inner experience meets the external environment. The false self encounters a culture that turns autonomy into an ideal, emotional control into a marker of success, and emotional silence into efficiency. Philosopher Byung-Chul describes this reality plainly. We live in a world that demands continuous performance, including emotional performance. In this world, needing others feels like failure. Pausing feels like weakness. Depending becomes something to overcome. Gradually, connection begins to feel like effort, like obligation, like something that consumes too much energy. Being alone, by contrast, feels lighter, more manageable. Not because human beings no longer need connection, but because connection has come to carry too many demands. This is why solitude can become so confusing. From the outside, it looks like choice, like freedom, like strength. It can even look fashionable, aligned with a modern lifestyle. But very often it is also a quiet form of armor, a way of ensuring that no one gets close enough to reactivate old requirements of adaptation. When Winnicott and Han are placed side by side, this is not about theory but continuity. One helps us understand how protection begins. The other shows why it is maintained. One speaks about the start of the story. The other describes the environment in which it continues. And this changes how we understand loneliness. Not all solitude is sadness. Not every preference for being alone is emotional coldness. For many people, being alone is the only place where they don't feel demanded, misread, or emotionally indebted, where they don't need to prove their worth or sustain versions of themselves that are exhausting. This is why so many people who like being alone are not cold. They are careful, not indifferent, but tired. They don't avoid love because they don't want it, but because they learned that loving came at too high a cost. For them, solitude is not absence, it is rest. So perhaps the question is not, why do I prefer being alone? But, when did being close start to hurt more than being distant? If that question resonated with you, what comes to mind when you sit with it? Because what now looks like a personality trait may be emotional memory. What looks like extreme introversion may be protection. And what looks like independence may simply be the quietest way of dealing with loneliness. And if this makes sense to you, know this. There is nothing wrong with needing less contact when contact has always demanded too much. Dealing with loneliness does not always begin by moving closer. Sometimes it begins by understanding why distance became necessary. When that question is asked gently, solitude stops being identity. It becomes part of the story, not its ending.